All right, what is going on, Chiefs Kingdom? Welcome back to the KC Sports Report. Michael Darcy, your host here as always. And today I'm going to break down if the Kansas City Chiefs should fire defensive coordinator Steve Spagnuolo. So the date is October 25th, 2021. The Kansas City Chiefs are coming off of an embarrassing loss to the Tennessee Titans in Tennessee by a final score of 27-3. By far the worst loss of the Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid era here in Kansas City. And a lot of Chiefs fans, including myself, are searching for answers. And, we could talk about how bad the offense is, and trust me, we have done that before. But the defense has been the overall problem all year. I mean, the Chiefs would probably have a winning record if the defense wasn't this bad. Now, that leaves a lot of Chiefs fans wanting major changes, and I'm one of those people. But is the major change in terms of the personnel, or is it in terms of coaching? In this video, we're going to break down whether it is Steve Spagnuolo's fault, why this defense is performing so poorly this year, or maybe it's the personnel. But before we get into this video, I'd like to say that if you haven't already, follow the show on Twitter. That's at KC Sports Report, and Instagram's KC_Sports Report. I provide you guys with constant updates on the team and just give you my overall thoughts on those social media platforms. And also subscribe, hit that like button, and turn those post notifications on for the YouTube videos, because this is a video topic that a lot of people have shown a lot of interest in, and quite frankly, it's one that I'm really looking forward to tackling. So, with that being said, let's jump right into it. So, Steve Spagnuolo was hired in 2019, coming off of the Bob Sutton era. And Bob Sutton, if you were a Chiefs fan throughout that time, I mean, he was pretty bad. I mean, the defenses in the early parts of his tenure weren't terrible, but Bob Sutton never made the necessary adjustments to win games. And he had a lot of talent on defense. I mean, he had prime Justin Houston, Eric Berry when he didn't have the bone spurs. He had, towards the end of Derek Johnson's career, he had a lot of talent. And, it really didn't work out, and he kind of wasted a lot of it. But, that just kind of goes to show you how bad Bob Sutton was. So hiring Steve Spagnuolo in 2019, it kind of seemed like, all right, as long as he's not as bad as Bob Sutton, it's a win. The Chiefs can work with that. And in 2019, the defense was good enough to win a Super Bowl. I mean, I will give Spags a lot of credit. In 2019, the defense wasn't very good to start out, but, a lot of moving pieces were accounted for, and the defense really turned the corner in like week 10. And they were good enough to ultimately go on and win the Super Bowl. And keep in mind, this was a time in which Patrick Mahomes ultimately bailed them out in the Super Bowl by coming back, but the defense had to hold the 49ers when it was 20-10, and to their credit, they did. But ever since then, this defense really hasn't been that good. The expectation every year with Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs' high-flying offense is that the defense at least pulls their weight. If they're mediocre or average, you can deal with that. You can still win. And, last year, I guess, was an example of them being able to overcome a bad defense. I mean, they were still able to get back to the Super Bowl. And, the main storyline in that Super Bowl was the offensive line collapsing. But the defense wasn't any good. Tom Brady and that running game moved across this field. They were totally dominant against this Chiefs defense. And that largely got overshadowed by how bad the offensive line was. But, the defense wasn't good in that game, and they didn't really address it in the offseason. Now, I know that I was one that believed that coming into this season, I thought this was the deepest Chiefs team we've ever seen, which in hindsight, I'm a complete idiot, but at the time, it made complete sense. I mean, on paper, you signed Jarron Reed, who was a big defensive tackle that could be a run stuffer, that could get to the quarterback. You were going to move Chris Jones outside. I thought that, all right, maybe Frank Clark could do something, and, Chris Jones on the other side, it would open up the field a little bit more, and Jarron Reed could get internal pressure. Therefore, the pass rush would be okay. I thought that trading for cornerback Mike Hughes and letting Bashaud Breeland walk was a good thing. And it seemed like, coming into the season, I mean, they looked all right in preseason. They didn't look terrible. But with the emergence of L'Jarius Sneed, I kind of thought that, all right, the cornerback group, it's not great, but it's good enough. They have enough talent with Tyrann Mathieu and Rashad Fenton and L'Jarius Sneed and some of the other guys that can kind of just be rotational pieces. But it's clear that in 2021, that is no longer the case. And they look bad. I mean, they look really, really bad. And, I don't want to say that this is completely unexpected because, like I said, this Chiefs defense has never been great, but they've never been this historically bad. And, in 2018, which was ultimately the last straw for Bob Sutton, when that defense finished last in the league, they had one of the worst secondaries of all time. And it ultimately was that team's big drawback, and that's why they did not make the Super Bowl that year. That's why the Patriots beat them. But in 2018, the Chiefs did one thing correct defensively. They could get after the quarterback. The defensive line, I believe, was second in the NFL in sacks behind the Pittsburgh Steelers. This year, they can't do anything right. They can't get after the quarterback. They can't stop anybody, specifically on the ground. They've got a terrible rush defense, and they have a pretty bad secondary. And, you can't deal with 3 phases of a bad defense. Now, going over the statistics, they're 32nd in points allowed, which means that they're first in points allowed. They're 32nd in yards allowed, which means they're giving up the most. They're 32nd in yards per play allowed, so they're giving up the most yards per play. They're 31st in pass yards allowed, so they're not the worst, but they're the second worst. They're 31st in rush yards allowed, which, again, is horrible. I believe it's only behind the Chargers. And they're 32nd, which means they're the worst team in giving up first downs. How do you expect to win a game when your defense is performing like that? And, I am a Chiefs fan that didn't really have lofty expectations for this defense. I thought that, maybe there was a shot they were top 10, but it was going to be like 10 or 11. And I at least expected them to be like top 15. I don't have that expectation anymore. The expectation is just not be last. But unfortunately, this Chiefs defense just is that bad. And they're a bottom half defense in this league. I believe that they're ranked 31st or 32nd overall. But there are major problems, there's major concerns, and it kind of falls at the feet of Steve Spagnuolo because a lot of the changes that we have not seen being made are simple ones. It's the simple stuff like covering the flats. You know how many times this season that a quarterback has just dumped it off in the flat to a running back or thrown a little screen pass or a dump off pass and his receiver gets 15 yards on a 3rd and long situation? That falls at the feet of Steve Spagnuolo. How are you not supplementing this? Like, how is it just you're so utterly confused on what opposing teams are trying to do when it's that blatantly obvious? Like, Spags, I thought you were smarter than this. And he's clearly not. And get this was the move that really made me angry. He did not start Juan Thornhill over Daniel Sorensen until week 6 of the NFL season. It took 5 weeks of below average Dan Sorensen to finally get him to start Juan Thornhill. I do not understand that. And I think that there's a lot of guys on this defense that should be playing over other guys. I don't know why DeAndre Baker is not playing over Mike Hughes, who's been a disaster this year. I think that Rashad Fenton should be starting over Travarius Ward because he's more physical, he's a better corner, and we're not seeing that. There's just simple personnel changes like Ben Neiman starting over Willie Gay. That is unacceptable. And again, that falls at the feet of Steve Spagnuolo. That's just ignorance. Like, you need to know which guys give you the best chance to win. And he simply doesn't understand that. And if that's not bad enough, it's that he's not calling the defensive plays correctly. If you've watched a single down on Chiefs defense this year, you would know that before the snap, this Chiefs team is running around on defense with their heads cut off. It looks like they do not understand what the play is. They don't understand where to be. They don't understand what their role is. They don't understand their assignment. And that's on Steve Spagnuolo. If your defensive scheme is too complicated for your players to understand, that's on you, buddy. Like, if your defensive players are not capable of grasping your scheme 6 and 7 weeks into an NFL season, that's a fireable offense. That is all on you. And yet again, Steve Spagnuolo has not simplified the scheme because these players are still confused. They still don't know where to be, and they're still out of place. And again, this is stuff that is easily changeable that Steve Spagnuolo has not done yet. And, I talked about the personnel. I think the personnel and the adjustments that he's failed to make could be in large part due to bias. I think that personnel bias is a very big thing within this organization, and it's not just Steve Spagnuolo. I think Andy Reid plays a big part in that as well. But I also think, and I'm not trying to get off the topic too much because this is should the Chiefs fire Steve Spagnuolo, not should the Chiefs fire Andy Reid. But Andy Reid has way too much trust in Steve Spagnuolo. And you can see that by the way that he just neglects to ever talk to Spags about how the defense is performing. If you're the head coach of a football team, you should have an input on offense and defense. That's why you're not a coordinator. And Andy Reid has not done that. And I think that Spags has got too much reign on this defense, and it hasn't worked. And I think that, in large part, that's because Andy kind of neglects him. But at the same point, I just don't think that Spags is as good of a coach as we thought he was. And, like I said, a lot of it is that his players don't understand the scheme. He's putting the wrong players in a position to be unsuccessful. My big saying this year has been the Chiefs coaching staff have not put the correct players in the right roles to be successful. A perfect example of this is Chris Jones continuing starting at defensive end. He has 2 sacks on the year, both coming in week 1. He has not been anywhere near productive on the edge this year. And yet, they still, week in and week out, line Chris Jones up as an edge rusher, and he does nothing. And again, this is stuff that is easily correctable, but he's too stubborn to get it. And like Frank Clark starting, if it was up to me, I would bench him. I think there's a lot of other guys that could do his job better than he could. And even though this defensive line doesn't have that much talent, Frank Clark is that big of a problem. But again, I'm not trying to nitpick on how bad Frank Clark is, because let's be honest, Steve Spagnuolo can't help with how bad Frank Clark is. But I also think that, the big thing in Spags' career is he's known for getting after the quarterback. He's known for blitzing and sending pressure. And this year, I haven't seen it. I've been screaming on Twitter that in 3rd and long situations, the Chiefs need to send the house. And they haven't done it. They've just kind of waited back there, let the offense come to them. And that's why on these screen passes, opposing teams are getting like 15 yards in a 3rd and long situation. It's because this Chiefs defense isn't aggressive. And I believe that in large part, that's due to Steve Spagnuolo. I think that he doesn't invoke any aggressiveness or sense of urgency in this defense. He just doesn't strike me as that kind of coach. I think that there's a lot of guys out there that would be doing a much better job of that, but Spags just kind of seems to me like a quiet guy that is going to keep trotting out the same personnel and seeing if anything is going to change. And it's pretty clear that that's not the case. It's not going to change. We're going to see the same product on the field every single week, and we're not going to see a different result. And I think that, again, the biggest problem with this Chiefs coaching staff, not even Steve Spagnuolo, is a sense of pride. They have too much of an ego. And I think that you got to put your ego aside for the betterment of the team and get over yourself, because there's a lot of coaching decisions that Steve Spagnuolo is clearly capable of making that he's just not. For one reason or another, he's not making them. I mean, if I'm Brett Veach, I'm saying, hey, why aren't you playing some of the draft picks that I gave you? I mean, these are first, second, and third round talents that you're just letting go to waste because Spags can't utilize these guys in the correct fashion. And, like I said, there's a big problem with what he's been doing, and the defense hasn't been good. I read you those stats. They're worse in pretty much every single defensive category that's worth mentioning. And that's a big problem. But at the same time, you can make the argument that, hey, maybe he doesn't have the personnel. Maybe the scheme that he's trying to teach his players, they're just not smart enough to understand. But, I seem to have a big problem with your players not understanding your scheme when, again, you've been in this system for 3 years. You're telling me that these guys that have been in this system for a long time now haven't yet understood your scheme? I don't understand that. If rookie linebacker Nick Bolton can come in right away and be the Mike guy in week 7 and flourish, you cannot tell me that this defense is too complicated for everybody. It almost seems like that is on the players, but at the same time, if your players are that ignorant and they can't get it, that falls on you. It might be unfortunate, but that's just kind of where I land right now. So, to answer the question, should the Chiefs fire Steve Spagnuolo? That's a tough question. And now, a lot of people are going to say, oh yeah, it's an easy one, it's a no-brainer, the Chiefs should fire him tomorrow. And while that sounds great in reality, it's really not. I wouldn't be against talking about firing Steve Spagnuolo in the offseason, because at that point, the defense has run its course. We saw a 2021 complete season of this Chiefs defense coached by Steve Spagnuolo. There is no excuse after this year. We saw what the product looked like, and after this season, we can evaluate where to go. But again, if you've paid attention to any of this Chiefs team's history, you would know that under the Andy Reid era, he does not let go of coordinators. You saw how long Bob Sutton stuck around, and that was because Andy Reid constantly went to bat for him. And I don't really think that anything is going to change. I think that Andy Reid is going to continue having blind trust in Steve Spagnuolo, who quite honestly, this year has been worse than Bob Sutton. And I really hate to say that, but it's kind of the harsh reality of the situation. This defense is worse than 2018. And I never thought that I would say that under this new defensive coordinator, but it's just the truth. This defense has been even worse than in 2018 when I thought it couldn't get any worse. So to answer the question, I think that in the offseason you can evaluate whether to cut him or not and move on. Go with somebody like Rex Ryan or another defensive coordinator with some spirit and some fire and who knows how to coach men. But I think until then, you got to roll with Spags, because I don't think that if you cut him tomorrow, you could add anybody from this Chiefs coaching staff that would be able to come close to replicating what Spags does. Now, keep in mind, Spags hasn't been good this year, but, if you cut him, you're going to have to go with a different guy that isn't as experienced as a defensive coordinator, and he's not going to be any better. So I think that kind of right now you're stuck with Spags, and I wouldn't be against firing him, but right now I think that he deserves the opportunity of finishing out this season. That's just kind of where I'm at right now. But Chiefs Kingdom, let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. I kind of went off on a rant there. I'm really passionate about this defense, man. Defense has just always been an area in which I feel like we could have improved, and we've just failed to do it in each and every offseason. And it's pretty clear that Patrick Mahomes can no longer carry this team with this bad of a defense. He did it in 2018 to an AFC Championship game where the defense ultimately let him down. The defense is letting him down week in, week out this year. And I think that in large part is due to Steve Spagnuolo. So with that being said, guys, I'm going to leave you with that. I do think, however, that this defense is going to get marginally better because they're starting to play some of the younger talent with Juan Thornhill, Nick Bolton starting to emerge onto the scene. Willie Gay has looked really, really good, but I just can't help but feel like this team isn't going to trend in a new direction until Steve Spagnuolo is out as defensive coordinator. Thank you for watching this video. If you guys enjoyed it, hit that like button, comment, and subscribe for more of the best Chiefs content on YouTube. You can also follow us on Instagram for more of the latest updates on future videos, as well as instant Chiefs news right after it happens. You can also support the channel via the Patreon, as well as buying merchandise from the KC Sports Report store on Teespring. The links to all of those websites will be in the description. You just listened to the KC Sports Report, presented by Michael Darcy.